Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Audra had always seemed like a woman ruled by logic, calculation, and poised confidence, someone whose movements were so precise they bordered on choreographed, but beneath that polished surface lived an obsession so consuming that no one could have predicted where it would ultimately lead, and certainly not Claire, who trusted Audra as a friend, sometimes even as a confidant, never suspecting that every smile, every offer to help, every comforting word was nothing but a mask hiding the first threads of a darkness spinning itself into something monstrous, something capable of swallowing a life whole. Meanwhile, Holden, enigmatic, charming, and perpetually restless, had become the catalyst for Audra's unraveling, a man who thrived on chaos, who viewed emotional boundaries as mere suggestions, who believed the world owed him more than he had been given, and whose influence on Audra grew like a weed choking the last remnants of her sanity as he whispered ideas she might once have rejected but now clung to as if he were the only source of truth in a universe that had betrayed her one too many times. And as their twisted bond deepened, so did their delusions, forming the foundations of a dark alliance that would ultimately target Claire, not because she had done anything wrong, but because in their fractured mind she represented everything they believed had been stolen from them: power, recognition, affection, and, more disturbingly, control. Claire had always been warm, effortlessly kind, and naturally magnetic, the sort of person who walked into a room and made everyone feel seen, but what she never realized was that her light cast shadows on those already teetering on instability, and Audra, whose envy had simmered beneath years of forced composure, saw Claire not as a friend but as an obstacle, a reminder of her own inadequacies. And Holden, ever hungry for manipulation, stoked those insecurities like coals in a dying fire, turning Audra's fragile resentment into something sharp and actionable as he dripped poison into her thoughts. Claire isn't who she seems, she's using you, she's laughing at you, until Audra became convinced that Claire was orchestrating her failures, undermining her reputation, even plotting to expose secrets Audra never once told her. And from that delusion was born the twisted plan that Holden encouraged with chilling enthusiasm. It began, as most tragedies do, with small steps disguised as harmless impulses. Audra testing boundaries by invading Claire's privacy, reading her messages, eavesdropping on her conversations, following her home under the pretense of coincidence, and with each boundary crossed, the guilt shrank while the obsession grew, especially as Holden validated every one of her fears, convincing her that what she felt was not madness but revelation, that Claire truly was dangerous, that Claire had to be dealt with before she ruined both of them. And Audra, clinging to Holden's approval like a lifeline, allowed herself to believe him, because the alternative, that she was losing control of her own mind, was far more terrifying. Together, they constructed a narrative where Claire became the villain, the saboteur, the threat, and in the echo chamber of their shared delusion, the idea of kidnapping Claire no longer felt unthinkable but inevitable, a necessary step in reclaiming the power they imagined she had stolen from them. And so they planned with chilling meticulousness, choosing a day when Claire would be alone, a route she regularly walked, a van Holden borrowed under a false name, and a basement in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town that Audra had discovered years earlier during one of her secret attempts to escape the overwhelming pressures of her life, never imagining that the place which once gave her solitude would become the stage for an unthinkable crime. Claire, unaware of the storm brewing around her, walked with the same gentle confidence she always had, humming a tune she couldn't quite remember the lyrics to as she followed the familiar path home, only to feel a sudden jolt of panic as the van screeched beside her and two masked figures grabbed her, covering her mouth before she could scream, binding her wrists, forcing her into darkness as her breath came in frantic bursts, her mind desperately trying to understand how the world had turned upside down in an instant. And even as she tried to identify her captors through their voices, she refused to believe the faint recognition she felt, Audra's trembling panic, Holden's low amusement, because it was too impossible, too grotesque. But when the masks finally came off in the basement's dim light, Claire's horror deepened into something indescribable, because reality was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. It was Audra and Holden, standing before her with a mixture of triumph and desperation in their eyes, and Claire, despite the fear coursing through her veins, tried to reason with them, offering compassion even in the face of betrayal, insisting she never hurt them, that she wanted to help, that they could still stop this, but Audra, unhinged and trembling, insisted that Claire had manipulated her life, stolen opportunities, poisoned relationships, sabotaged dreams, and Holden stood behind her like a dark puppeteer, whispering encouragement, fueling her conviction that this was justice, not cruelty. Over the hours that followed, Claire pleaded, reasoned, begged, but every word she spoke was twisted by their delusional logic, every attempt at empathy reframed as manipulation, until finally Holden decided that Claire's existence itself was too dangerous, that letting her go would risk exposure, that she would ruin them in revenge, and Audra, torn between the last shreds of morality and the suffocating need to keep Holden's approval, hesitated just long enough for Claire to see the woman she once knew flicker behind the madness, but only for a moment, because Holden, growing impatient, grabbed a crowbar and insisted they finish what they started, and though Audra initially tried to stop him, she ultimately gave in, her mind fracturing under the weight of paranoia and devotion, allowing Holden to strike the first blow. Claire collapsed in agony, her breath hitching in sharp sobs as she tried to crawl away, whispering Audra's name in disbelief, but Audra, overwhelmed by the reality of what they were doing, couldn't bring herself to watch yet couldn't bring herself to intervene either, trapped in a psychological limbo of guilt and dependence, and Holden, emboldened by her inaction, continued until Claire's movements stilled and her breath faded into nothingness, leaving the basement in a chilling silence broken only by Audra's hysterical sobs as the weight of the irreversible finally crashed down on her. Holden, however, felt no remorse, only exhilaration, a sense of power he hadn't tasted in years, and he immediately began strategizing how they would dispose of the body, how they would erase evidence, how they would craft alibis, speaking with clinical detachment as if they had merely completed a difficult task rather than extinguished a life, and Audra, shattered, followed his instructions in a dazed autopilot, unable to process the enormity of what she had done, convincing herself that it was Holden who killed Claire, not her, even though she knew deep down she shared the blame, because without her jealousy, her delusions, her willingness to follow Holden into madness, none of this would have happened. After burying Claire in a shallow grave behind the farmhouse, they scrubbed the basement, burned the ropes, wiped fingerprints, and returned home separately, but the moment Audra stepped into the quiet of her apartment, reality slammed into her with unbearable force, and she collapsed to the floor, shaking, reliving every moment, hearing Claire's pleas echoing in her mind, seeing the disbelief in her eyes, the betrayal, the pain, and though Holden called her repeatedly, urging her to stay calm, to stick to the story, to remember that this was Claire's fault, not theirs, Audra could feel the walls of her sanity closing in, suffocating her with guilt she could no longer rationalize away. Over the following days, Claire's disappearance sparked a frenzy of concern among her friends and family. Posters plastered the town, vigils were held, and interviews aired on local news, each one chipping away at Audra's composure as she lied through forced smiles, claiming she hadn't seen Claire in days, offering fake tears while Holden watched her closely, ready to intervene if she cracked. But the pressure became unbearable when detectives began asking questions, especially after someone reported seeing Claire arguing with a blonde woman shortly before she vanished, a description uncomfortably close to Audra, and though the police had no concrete evidence, the mere possibility of exposure pushed Holden to tighten his influence over Audra, insisting that she remain loyal, reminding her that if she confessed he would blame everything on her and walk free, and the threat of abandonment, combined with the fear of prison and the guilt eating her alive, kept her trapped in the nightmare she helped create. But guilt is a relentless predator, and it gnawed at Audra until she could barely distinguish nightmares from waking life, seeing Claire in reflective surfaces, hearing her voice whisper accusations at night, feeling phantom hands around her wrists, until finally, after weeks of torment, Audra broke, arriving at the police station trembling and sleep-deprived, sobbing so violently she could barely speak as she confessed everything, the obsession, the kidnapping, the basement, the grave, and though detectives initially assumed she was hallucinating, the sheer detail of her recounting led them to search the farmhouse, where they found Claire's body exactly where Audra said it would be. Holden was arrested within hours, furious, screaming that Audra betrayed him, that she was weak, that she ruined everything, but Audra, sitting alone in her holding cell, felt both devastated and relieved. mourning Claire's life while finally free from Holden's psychological grip, yet forever chained to the consequences of her actions, a tragic reminder of how envy, manipulation, and madness can intertwine so tightly they strangle the humanity out of a person until all that remains is the darkest version of themselves. And as the town reeled from the shocking revelation, Claire's family grieved, Holden plotted revenge from behind bars, and Audra spent her days wishing she could turn back time, wishing she had never met Holden, wishing she had never allowed jealousy to blind her, wishing she had listened to Claire's gentle voice when she had the chance, because in the end, the dark alliance she formed in desperation destroyed not only Claire but herself as well, leaving a legacy of tragedy carved into the memories of everyone who once believed Audra incapable of such monstrousness, proving that darkness, when nurtured, grows wild and consumes everything in its path, including the very soul of the person who feeds it. In the weeks following Audra's confession, as the cold routines of jail numbed her senses and the fluorescent lights of the interrogation room became more familiar than sunlight, the enormity of everything she had lost began to take shape in ways she could barely process. Yet despite the crushing weight of consequence bearing down on her, part of her felt a strange, hollow clarity, an understanding of just how deeply she had allowed madness to take root, how thoroughly she had surrendered her identity to Holden's toxic influence, and how irrevocably those choices had destroyed the life of a woman who had only ever offered kindness. And though the legal proceedings moved slowly, mired in psychological evaluations, court motions, and media chaos, Audra's mind remained frozen in the moment Claire's voice faded into silence, replaying the image of Claire reaching toward her, not in anger or hatred, but in heartbreaking disbelief, and the memory clung to Audra like a shadow she could never outrun, haunting her even as lawyers argued over whether she acted under duress or shared equal responsibility in the crime, while reporters outside the courthouse dissected every detail of her life, transforming her from a once respected figure into a public symbol of envy, obsession, and collapse. Meanwhile, Holden, locked in his separate cell with a hardened indifference, reacted to the unfolding events not with remorse but with seething fury, pacing like a caged predator as he blamed everyone but himself, the system, Audra's weakness, Claire's imagined provocations, and he spent his days crafting delusional narratives where he cast himself as a misunderstood anti-hero betrayed by a woman too fragile to handle the truth, writing letters he knew Audra would never receive, filled with threats, pleas, and manipulative promises meant to pull her back under his control. And though the jail intercepted them long before they could reach her, the knowledge that Holden still wanted to tighten his influence made Audra's nights more suffocating, fueling nightmares in which Holden's voice echoed through the cell, convincing her that Claire wasn't really dead or that the police were coming to blame her for other crimes she never committed. And each morning she woke trembling, drenched in cold sweat as the line between reality and dreams blurred just enough to make her question whether she would ever know peace again. Outside the walls of the jail, the town that once felt ordinary was now consumed by a frenzy of grief, shock, and morbid curiosity, because Claire's death had ruptured more than one life. It fractured a community's sense of safety, casting suspicion on neighbors and co-workers as people wondered how such darkness had festered right under their noses, and Claire's family, shattered by pain, clung to her memory through vigils and rallies demanding justice, their tearful interviews fueling public outrage that threatened to overwhelm the legal process. While Audra's parents, horrified and confused, avoided the cameras as they struggled to reconcile the daughter they once knew with the monstrous headlines describing her as a calculating murderer, yet even they could not deny that something in her had changed long before Claire's disappearance, though they had never imagined the depths of that change until now. As the trial approached, psychologists debated whether Audra's actions stemmed from mental instability, emotional manipulation, or willful malice, and though Audra cooperated with every evaluation, she refused to blame her illness or her childhood or the pressures she had endured. She insisted instead, with a raw honesty that startled even her own attorneys, that she had made choices she could never undo, choices fueled by jealousy, fear, and the desire to feel significant in Holden's eyes. And it was this confession, more than anything, that convinced prosecutors they would secure a conviction, because juries were far more likely to sympathize with someone who insisted they were innocent than someone who accepted guilt with clear-eyed sorrow. Yet even as Audra's legal fate loomed, she found herself fixated not on the trial but on Claire's family, unable to stop imagining their grief, their rage, their confusion, wondering whether they ever sensed how close Claire had been to danger, or if Audra had been so skilled at mimicry that no one ever stood a chance of seeing her unraveling until it was too late, and she often lay awake replaying the last conversation she ever had with Claire before the abduction, a simple exchange about weekend plans, a moment so normal, so innocent, that thinking about it felt like swallowing broken glass, because she realized only now that Claire had genuinely cared for her, had trusted her, had confided in her, and the realization made the cruelty of what she had done feel even more unbearable. Meanwhile, Holden, ever defiant, spent his nights crafting speeches in his mind, planning how he would manipulate the courtroom, imagining the headlines proclaiming his brilliance or framing him as a charismatic victim of a deranged woman, and he fantasized about someday writing a book or giving interviews that would elevate him from criminal to infamous personality, because in his warped reality, notoriety was just another form of power. And he had always craved power in whatever form he could seize it, even if it meant destroying lives, and though no one outside his cell knew the extent of his fantasies, the guards sometimes overheard him rehearsing monologues or mocking Claire's final moments with a chilling lack of empathy, and those who listened carried the memory of his voice with them long after their shift ended. When the trial finally began, the courtroom buzzed with a tension so thick it felt suffocating, packed with reporters, spectators, and grieving loved ones filling every available seat, and as Audra was escorted inside in handcuffs, she kept her gaze low, refusing to meet the eyes of Claire's family, feeling both undeserving and terrified of whatever she might see reflected in their sorrow, while Holden, entering moments later with an arrogant smirk, scanned the crowd as if searching for an audience that might appreciate his performance, offering a faint nod to a cluster of cameras as though greeting old friends, and the stark contrast between their demeanors only further fueled the narrative that Holden was the manipulator and Audra his broken accomplice, though the truth, complex and tangled, resisted any simple categorization. The prosecution presented a meticulous timeline of events, painting the alliance between Audra and Holden as a mutually reinforcing descent into violence, while the defense attempted to distinguish Audra's motivations from Holden's, arguing that she was a vulnerable woman exploited by a charismatic predator, though even they could not deny she had played an active role in the crime, and as witnesses took the stand, friends, co-workers, neighbors, the portrait of Claire that emerged was so vibrant, so achingly genuine, that Audra often fought tears as she listened, reminded again and again of the magnitude of the life she had helped extinguish. Holden, by contrast, seemed bored by the testimonies, occasionally rolling his eyes, whispering sarcastic remarks to his attorney, or studying the reporters' reactions as if judging his own performance, and though he was repeatedly reprimanded by the judge, he remained incapable of showing remorse, a fact that only solidified the jury's growing contempt for him. But it was when the prosecution unveiled the photographs of the basement, the shallow grave, and the tools Holden left behind that the courtroom fell into a heavy silence, and Audra, overwhelmed by the images, broke into trembling sobs, struggling to breathe as the weight of her actions crashed over her with renewed force, while Holden remained disturbingly composed, even amused, as though he were merely an observer rather than the architect of horror. When Audra finally took the stand, her voice shaking but steady enough to speak, she gave a full, unflinching account of everything that happened, sparing no detail of her own involvement or Holden's corrosive psychological control. And though every word cut into her like a blade, she continued, determined to honor Claire with the truth she should have spoken long before the crime ever occurred, while Holden, watching her with an expression of cold betrayal, muttered under his breath that she was lying, weak, pathetic, a traitor, though no one believed him anymore. And when the verdicts were finally delivered, Holden guilty on all counts, Audra guilty but with acknowledgement of diminished capacity, the courtroom rippled with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and exhausted justice, while Claire's family wept quietly, not in celebration but in mourning for everything that could never be restored, and Audra, hearing the sentence that would determine the rest of her life, felt neither shock nor anger, only a profound, hollow acceptance that this was the punishment she deserved, though she also felt a faint, flickering hope that perhaps, in time, she might learn how to mourn Claire in a way that honored her memory rather than drowned in guilt. While Holden was dragged from the courtroom in restraints, screaming promises of revenge, threats of appeal, and accusations that the world had conspired against him, though for the first time in his life, his voice held no real power, no real audience, no real sway, and as the bars clanged shut behind each of them, sealing their fates, the world outside the prison walls began, slowly and painfully, to heal, though the wound left by Claire's death would never fully close, and Audra found herself facing a lifetime of reflection. Grappling with the monstrous version of herself she had become, searching for fragments of humanity in the rubble of her shattered identity, knowing that forgiveness, from others or from herself, might never come, yet determined, in whatever small ways she could, to confront the darkness she once embraced and ensure it never consumed another soul again.